All right, let's get straight to it. This isn't about how we feel about technology. This is a system analysis. We're here to look at the raw mechanics of cognition and trace what happens when a core human system, the ability to think, starts to break down.
And this really gets to the heart of the matter. The problem isn't that thinking is vanishing. It's that the entire system that produces it is being intentionally bypassed. So this isn't some debate about whether people are getting smarter or dumber. We're here to examine the consequences of disengaging the very process that builds intelligence in the first place. So we're going to treat thinking like any other system. First, we'll map out its core components and how they're supposed to function. Then we'll isolate the exact point of failure that's causing the entire thing to collapse. Okay, so our analysis begins with a fundamental change in the brain's job description. It's a huge shift from being the primary engine of thought to, well, becoming something else entirely. For most of human history, your brain was the processor. It did all the heavy lifting, the analysis, the synthesis, the hard work. But today, its role has been, for lack of a better word, downgraded. It's becoming a prompt generator. Its main function now is to figure out how to ask an external system to do the actual processing for it. We're outsourcing the cognitive engine. And as we're about to see, that has massive consequences. So, to figure out how the system fails, we first have to understand how it's designed to work. We need a baseline. And that baseline is the thinking loop. This is the model for a healthy, functional cognitive system.
See, thinking isn't just a single action. It's a self-correcting loop. It all starts with an input, a question or a problem. This kicks off the processing stage, where your brain actually works to generate a potential solution. That solution then gets tested against reality, which creates feedback. And that feedback, especially the errors it shows you, is what you use to refine your approach until you get to a correct output. Every single step here is crucial.
Now, this processing stage, it is the absolute heart of the system. This is the engine room. It's where your working memory is juggling information, where your executive control is focusing your attention, where you're simulating possibilities. This is where you feel that mental strain we call cognitive load. And that friction, that effort, is absolutely necessary. It's the signal that forces your brain's neural circuits to adapt and get stronger. No friction, no learning. It's really that simple. And the feedback stage? It's driven by something we all try to avoid: error. When you make a prediction and you're wrong, your brain generates this incredibly powerful error signal. That signal is the trigger for learning. Correcting for that error is literally what strengthens your neural pathways and sharpens your mental models. So if there's no error, there's no signal to update the system. Okay, now let's introduce the disruption. What happens when we insert a single, tiny, and seemingly harmless action into this vital loop? What happens when we just copy an answer? The simplicity of this is actually what makes it so alarming. The copy-paste shortcut doesn't just weaken the thinking loop, it completely severs it. The process jumps straight from input to output, totally bypassing the two most critical stages, processing and feedback. The cognitive engine is just turned off, and the ability to build understanding goes with it. The consequence here is totally unambiguous. When you remove the core mechanism for transforming information and correcting mistakes, the cognitive system stops building intelligence. It just becomes a conduit for information, not a generator of understanding. Think about it. The cognitive load of copying an answer that already exists is pretty much zero. And the result of zero cognitive load is zero neural adaptation. Without that struggle, there's no signal telling the brain it needs to change. This leads to zero meaningful retention and zero development of actual reasoning skills. So, breaking the cognitive loop isn't a one-time event. It's the trigger for a cascading failure. And we can actually map out the predictable, long-term consequences of this system breakdown. This failure pattern starts with the very seductive illusion of perceived efficiency. Getting answers fast feels super productive, right? But this leads to reduced engagement because the brain learns to avoid the hard work. Over time, that results in skill atrophy. Your reasoning abilities get weaker from disuse, just like a muscle you never exercise. And the final stage? Dependency. The external tool becomes a crutch you literally can't function without. This also reveals a really crucial shift in what our brain is even doing. We're moving from thinking, the active, difficult construction of knowledge, to simply recognizing, which is the passive, low-effort job of just identifying a pattern you've seen before. Recognition feels deceptively easy, and we mistake this fluency for genuine understanding, and that is a dangerous illusion. This leads us to another critical distinction. Real understanding is proven by your ability to reconstruct knowledge from its basic principles, to apply it in a totally new context. Copying, on the other hand, is just the ability to reproduce an output, and that copied knowledge is brittle. It shatters the moment the context changes.
So, the ultimate price of consistently bypassing the thinking process becomes chillingly clear. We start to see a measurable decline in abstract reasoning, a weaker ability to solve new problems, the erosion of our own internal mental models of the world, and a dangerous dependency on external systems for our most basic cognitive functions.
This brings us to the final, and maybe the most critical, distinction in this entire analysis: the difference between information and intelligence. And this table just illustrates the core argument perfectly. Information access is external, it's effortless, and it's all about retrieval. Intelligence, however, is internal, it is effort-dependent, and it's based on the transformation of that information. Accessing information is not the same as building intelligence. One is a library, the other is the architect who uses the library's materials to actually build something new.
Let's be clear, external tools can produce answers. They can even simulate creativity, but they cannot produce intelligence inside the user. That is a biological process that only you can run.
So this leaves us with a very simple, logical question that applies to any system, whether it's biological or mechanical. What's the inevitable outcome for a system whose core function is never used? The answer is simple. A system that is consistently bypassed stops developing. And eventually, it loses its original function. It atrophies.
And this leads to a final, pretty provocative thought. Maybe you're not actually observing the collapse of thinking. Maybe what you're really witnessing is a great separation between two groups, thinkers and consumers. The cognitive loop itself isn't broken. It's our engagement with it that's changing, creating two very different cognitive paths forward.